When I was thinking about this series, I knew there was one person I absolutely had to begin with: Noam Chomsky. You know him as the path-breaking linguist and radical public intellectual. I think his work gets us right into the heart of these debates about technocracy. On the one hand, Noam Chomsky is a self-described old-school Enlightenment figure. That's the Noam Chomsky that's the champion of free speech, rationality, science, learning, critical thinking. In his famous 1967 essay on intellectuals, he said, "It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies." Of course, as you know, they don't often do that. Which brings me to the other Chomsky, the Chomsky that's the critic of so-called experts. He also said in that same 1967 essay, quote, "The cult of the expert is both self-serving and, for those who propound it, fraudulent." His early writing on Cold War intellectuals stem from his anarchist theory of knowledge and political authority. It's a theory that celebrates the expertise and the moral clarity of ordinary people, and a theory that downplays the convoluted ideas of those who rule us. So, for the rest of the program, I speak with Professor Noam Chomsky. We'll talk about the place of technical expertise in a radical left project. We'll cover the anarchist critique of bureaucracy, the right-wing critique of bureaucracy, and more. It's a wide-ranging discussion on Noam's philosophy of expertise, education, and popular reason. Stay tuned. Well, I just wanted to start with a bit of a personal story, and it's the first time I ever interacted with you. You probably don't remember, but I was first or second year university, and I was involved with an activist group that was supporting a flotilla to Gaza. And at the time, the right-wingers on campus viciously attacked us and slandered us, and it made it all the way up to the National Post, which is the kind of premier right-wing paper in Canada. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I sent you an email asking if you would write something in support of us, because I thought it would galvanize me and my colleagues. And you did. And I was surprised and I was really touched. And I just, it made me feel good. Like what mattered to me mattered to you, no matter how small. So I always wanted to thank you for that.
That's great. I once had the opportunity to support a Gaza flotilla in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
I was there with a group of linguists, actually, some from Canada, who were attending an international linguistics conference organized by a Gaza university. Couldn't get many people interested, but we got about a dozen or so. And it happened that we were there just at the time when a relief ship was trying to come in with humanitarian aid and blocked by the Israeli Navy, and had a demonstration at the port.
Mm-hmm.
Was able to speak about it, so wasn't the only time.
Might have been one of the ships that we were supporting, and we won that battle, I must say.
Could have been.
But I wanted to start there. I mean, you're known for being quite accessible, responding to people's emails, going on people's podcasts like mine, despite being kind of this stratospheric heights of kind of intellectual life. It must take a lot of work. I'm curious as to why you maintain that ethic of being open, accessible, and supportive, sort of no matter how seemingly small the cause might be for a student like me, for instance.
That's what matters in the world. Was put rather well by my friend, close friend, the late Howard Zinn, who once wrote that what matters in history is the innumerable unknown people who do the work on the ground that lays the basis for the great moments that sometimes follow. They're the important ones. So there couldn't be anything more important.
So I wanted to ask you about the politics of intellectualism and technocracy in particular. And I thought maybe as a entrance to it to go kind of as biographical um, as I can. And one of the things that strikes me in a number of interviews that I've seen, you've spoken about working class intellectuals. And I have a quote here, and I thought I would just read it. You talked about in one interview, the radical intellectuals of my childhood were different. They were working class relatives in New York, mostly unemployed during the Depression. Though one uncle with a disability had a newsstand thanks to New Deal measures and was so able to help support much of my family. You go on to say that these intellectual circles were quite vibrant and in constant discussion about the latest performances of the Budapest String Quartet, the controversies between Stuckel and Freud, radical politics and activism, and on and on. So I was curious to learn a little bit more about these early intellectuals and how they influenced your own understanding of what an intellectual is and what their role is in society.
It wasn't so novel. If you haven't looked at it, there's a great book by, I think his name is Jonathan Rose, on, I can check it if my memory is not quite right. It's about 19th century working class reading habits. What were working class people reading and discussing in Britain in the 19th century? These are working people living in awful conditions. Read Dickens, for example. It turns out has about an 800-page book on it, looking at it in detail. They were reading what we now call classics, the leading works of English literature, older classics. In fact, his conclusion is they were better educated than the aristocracy, which was frittering away their time, playing games at Oxford and so on. And he actually shows this. And it's not so unusual. Come to the United States around the same time, mid-19th century. Working class people who were literate but unschooled, they hadn't gone to school, were studying the labor theory of value as developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They hadn't heard of Marx, and working out ways to apply it to lay a background for their quite sharp and intelligent critique of employment, capitalist employment, as a fundamental attack on the rights of an individual, their dignity, their basic rights as, in their words, free citizens of a republic. Sophisticated work, people who never went to school. This is an old working class tradition. I mean, in Boston, say, an Irish blacksmith who never had any education, if he had a little money, might hire a boy to read to him classics while he was working. It took a lot of work to beat this out of people's heads. And it's not that it's a sudden development. It's something that grew naturally, was a large part of the working class tradition, had to be beaten out of their heads. Same was true in the agricultural society. Often women, in fact, mainly women probably, were reading also classic work, and it's just part of life.
I remember in one of our episodes, we talked to Thomas Frank about populism, and he talked to me about populist periodicals traded amongst farmers where they're discussing Shakespeare and Dante and things like that. But when you say it's beaten out of them, it's also beaten out of kind of the popular liberal consciousness that that working class people are intelligent at all or capable of self-governance. Where do you think that kind of strand of elitist kind of anti-populist thinking comes from for you?
Well, we can trace that back a long way. Go back to the first democratic revolution in modern times in England, in the mid-17th century. The way we're taught about it in school is it was a conflict between king and Parliament finally won out, and then came the Glorious Revolution and British democracy. Well, that's part of the story. Now, the other part of the story was, what about the population? Well, it turns out that they had a very lively literature. Pamphlet literature publication was possible then. There were also itinerant workmen, preachers, quite a lively intellectual culture. We have many of their publications, the Levelers and others, but they were going all over the country. They were talking to people, as they put it in their pamphlets, who didn't want to be ruled by king or Parliament, didn't want to be ruled by knights and gentlemen, but by people like ourselves who know the people's wants. That's what we want to be governed by, ourselves, not you, the rich and powerful. So go somewhere else. This was considered outrageous. The people who called themselves the men of best quality didn't want to tolerate any of this nonsense from the rabble. You know, people talking about healthcare, education, workers' rights, and so on. Got to crush them. Well, that was it's basically what went into history. It's the men of best quality who write history.
Right.
So that's the version we get. But there's a lot known, and in fact, quite good scholarship on the work on the ground. Christopher Hill, many others. Well, let's go a century further to the next democratic revolution, the American Revolution. The American Revolution was, what we know about is the founders, a small group of wealthy white male slave owners who gathered in Philadelphia and wrote the Constitution. In fact, by the standards of the day, a pretty distinguished group, but they weren't the only ones. There were also the radical farmers, the ones who erupted in Shays' Rebellion, for example. They wanted democracy. The founders didn't.
Yeah.
In fact, the main scholarly work on the gold standard for scholarship is Michael Klarman's book, which is called The Framers' Coup, the coup against democracy. The framers wanted to make sure that it would be the men of best quality, as they put it, the responsible men, the people who understand the rights of property owners. As James Madison put it, he wanted the power to be in the hands of what he called the wealth of the nation. The Senate was designed in such a way as to be the most powerful institution and unelected. It was the wealth of the nation. People who understand, still quoting Madison, that prime goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And it was a battle right through. In fact, the reason for the 10 amendments is to try to calm down the general population who didn't like what was being foisted on them. Well, that's the next step. We go on plenty more, I'm skipping a lot, but go to the 20th century, same thing. Take a look at the leading liberal intellectuals, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann, who I've often quoted, wrote about all these things. He was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal. His view was the same as the 17th century. The men of best quality have to be protected from the general population who are stupid and ignorant. We have to be, as he put it, protected from the roar and the trampling of the bewildered herd. And we have to do this. We can't do it by force anymore. So we have to do it by what he called manufacturing consent. Ed Herman and I borrowed the phrase for a book of ours, but
Yeah.
it's Lippmann's. We have to manufacture consent so that the general public will recognize that they can be only spectators, not participants. That you read the same thing in Reinhold Niebuhr and Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, all liberals, incidentally, much harsher on the right. Uh,
Of course.
so there's a strain that runs right through. And it's understandable that they should think that the general public is stupid and ignorant, and that they should work to ensure that that's the case. Okay, that's why we have, take a look at the neoliberal educational programs. This is bipartisan, incidentally. Obama, the rest of them. You probably went through it. It's teaching to test. Try to make sure that students are as stupid and ignorant as they can possibly be. I mean, in the Enlightenment, what's now called the liberal programs was ridiculed. The idea of what's now called teaching to test was compared with pouring water into a vessel and having some of it leak out. It was considered the worst conceivable form of education. But it has a purpose. It does make people as stupid and ignorant as you can imagine a person to be. No inquiry, no questions. You don't have unschooled workmen running around the country telling you that having a job is an intolerable attack on your rights and dignity as a free person. We don't want any of that stuff. We want people to think that the highest goal in life is to get a job and to be the servant of a master for most of your waking hours. In fact, we have huge industries devoted to it. What's called the advertising industry, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And what's it for? What it's for is to turn you into a mindless consumer, an uninformed person who makes irrational decisions. You're not supposed to notice that this is the opposite of what you're taught in Econ 101, where markets are hailed as wonderful because you have informed citizens making rational decisions. Is that what you see on a television set?
No.
I mean,
Absolutely. So anarchism offers the most astute critique, I think, of intellectual and expert authority and domination of all stripes. And I read that you came across anarchism as a child, seeing and speaking to anarchists, mostly Spanish emigres, in radical bookstores. And I'm curious if you could sort of take yourself back a little bit to when you first discovered it. I mean, what was it like for you, and why do you think it appealed?
well, it's a long time ago, so I remember the exact moment. We're going back 85 years, but when I was we lived in Philadelphia, which is about an hour away from New York. And by the time my parents would allow me to take a train by myself, say about 12 years old, I would take a train to New York. There was an easy train. I'd stay with my relatives, including this uncle who you mentioned, who had the newsstand. One of the most educated people I ever met, never got past fourth grade. So they had a small apartment. I could stay there and spent a lot of time talking to him. Went down to, I don't know if you know New York City, but I went down to what's now Union Square, 42nd Street, which had the anarchist offices, Freie Arbeiterstimme, other left wing. It was a very lively period, I should say, lots of political activism. And down, it's now gentrified, but in those days, Fourth Avenue, downtown from Union Square, had small stores, a lot of bookstores, secondhand bookstores, a lot of them run by people fleeing Europe. A lot were Spanish emigres. There were Spanish anarchist emigres, I'd go into the bookstores, talk to the owners. They're glad to talk to a young kid, pick up pamphlets, same in the offices, and just, in fact, I got a lot of the literature that I later used when I was writing about these things. By now, most of this stuff is available, but when I was writing about it 50 years ago, nothing was available. So, but it just basically went on from there.
So in this episode, we're looking at the topic of technocracy, both as an idea, but also as a short-lived movement inspired by Thorstein Veblen and others, who gained a lot of prominence during the height of the Great Depression. And technocracy has a kind of intuitive appeal because it's a kind of politics of plenty. It is ostensibly egalitarian, but it's certainly not democratic, right? Because it's about experts being put in charge. And we were just talking about that earlier. I'm wondering when you first came across technocracy and technocrats and what you made of them, what you made of people like Thorstein Veblen, and then later Howard Scott and Loeb and others who were involved in really agitating for a political program.
Well, I read Veblen, was very much interested in him. Also, Veblenite economists like Robert Brady, very fine economist background, early 40s. But I myself gave a different twist to it, partly because of experience. I didn't see any reason why everybody couldn't be an expert. I mean, like if I want my refrigerator fixed, I don't know how to do it. So I'll call in somebody who's technically trained to do it. Maybe somebody who never went through high school, but can do things that I couldn't possibly do because they have all kind of skills I don't have. And if he wants to talk to me about the war in Ukraine, I have some skills he doesn't have.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody can be an expert in their own domains. I have sometimes lived in rural areas, and it's just amazing to see the array of skills and abilities that people just have just because of their lives. Never went to school and stuff. I remember once I used to go for summer vacations out to Cape Cod, and there was a guy there who would fix our small sailboat and things like that. I got to know him pretty well. He told me that he once was suggested to him that he go to Cape Cod Technical College to learn how to do these things better. He went for a while. He found pretty quickly that he knew more than the instructors did, so he just dropped down. Well, those are the kind of skills you get in places like that. Not much formal, maybe some form. By now, of course, there's formal education. They go to high school and so on, but that's not where it comes from. Mm-hmm. So why can't these, it's true that you're going to pick experts on particular topics, like in my own academic work. If I want to learn something about Icelandic phonology, I go to an expert, somebody who studied it, but doesn't have a position of greater authority than I have. Mm-hmm. We just share our expertise. So why can't that be true across the society? There are people who are particularly good at some things. I mean, if I have a heart problem, I'm going to go to a heart specialist, not an auto mechanic, but doesn't have to be any hierarchy of authority involved. Mm-hmm. So I don't think technocracy has to lead or even should lead to a hierarchically structured society, just a society where people pursue their own skills and interests, contribute to the general community with them.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just thinking about the instructors at that university, Cape Cod, not really knowing very much. It's funny because I was reading about Howard Scott, and apparently he had some engineering background, but he was exposed to be a bit of a fraud and not an expert on things. But about him, I think one of the things that's interesting is that, at least in this period, the IWW commissioned Howard Scott, and I think at one point he even led one of their kind of research offices. So there was this kind of socialist interest in technocracy, which leads me to sort of a question about why you think they might have been interested in Scott, and more of a general question about what is the relationship between socialism and technocracy.
Depends what we mean by socialism. If today what the term means is either Soviet totalitarianism or moderate social democracy, like the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what socialism was in its origins. Socialism was what I was describing before, the idea that the very concept of wage labor is utterly intolerable. You go back to the Knights of Labor, first great labor movement in the United States, mid-19th century. Its slogan was, those who work in the mills should own them. There's a large literature of what were called factory girls, young women from the farms who went to work in the Eastern Massachusetts mills. Same thing. We don't want to be subjected to a master. We should control our own work, our own labor. The fruits of our labor shouldn't be taken from us by an absentee owner that, in fact, was backed by sophisticated work on labor theory of value of the kind I mentioned, developed by people who are totally unschooled, but were reading the classics and thinking about them. Well, that's socialism. Its basic idea was worker control over production, democratic control over other institutions. By the early 19th century, 20th century, that had been overwhelmed by other tendencies, Leninist, social democratic, but it's a different kind of socialism. When Bernie Sanders, for example, who I greatly admire, I should say, I'm not criticizing him, when he calls himself a socialist, he's what would have been called a mild social democrat, and good-hearted, looking for good things, but totally remote from socialism.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the United States is so backward in this respect that it's almost laughable. For example, there was an article, remember a while ago, in the London Financial Times, leading business journal in the world, not exactly a radical journal. And the article pointed out that if Bernie Sanders was in Germany, he could be running on the Conservative Party ticket, which in fact is true if you think about it. His main positions, universal health care, free higher education, is just the norm in much of the world. United States, it's considered too radical to be accepted by the population. It's an interesting fact about the United States. Very free country, but very repressive. Mm-hmm. Socially very backward. And but if you look at real socialism, it's has no problems with technocracy in the sense that I described, mm-hmm. where there is technical expertise of various kinds, maybe fixing a refrigerator, fixing a sailboat, helping on the farm, whatever it may be, or doing academic work, or becoming a surgeon, or whatever. That's. But the point is, these are delegated roles, totally subject to popular control, which is not such an exotic idea, after all. So in Europe, doctors, physicians are mostly civil servants, that just like post office workers, not individual entrepreneurs who enrich themselves. These are special kinds of social conditions, not forced by any kind of technocratic principle.
Mm-hmm. The difference there is the kind of hierarchy of domination. It's not that technical expertise per se is a problem. So you mentioned the kind of warped version of socialism, and I wanted to ask you about Bakunin's critique of the red bureaucracy. So you wrote in the 70s that Bakunin made a series of analyses and predictions that may be among the most remarkable within the social sciences. Bakunin warned that the new class of intellectuals will attempt to convert their access to knowledge into power over economic and social life. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about his prediction and how he was able to make it, if it's indeed one of the most remarkable in the social sciences.
It is. This was a critique of what he saw as the Marxist intellectuals. You can ask how fair the critique was, but he was capturing something real. He said they're going to try to create a red bureaucracy which will beat the people with the people's stick. It'll claim to be for the people. He was talking about social democracy too, but it'll be beating them. And they'll create the red bureaucracy, which will be the most repressive and violent that we've ever seen in the history of the world. Not far off. It's long before. This is back in the mid-19th century. But he was pointing to something that's that you can see it's common. It's back to the men of best quality in the 17th century. It's a common thread running through the entire modern history, of course, as you know, the earlier roots are so obvious that you don't even talk about them. You know, the nobles, just the church just had the power. But these questions arise as more democratic societies develop, where people do have the opportunity to take some degree of control over their own lives, and that has to be beaten down by the men of best quality, self-defined. In the Kennedy years, was just an explosion of these ideas. You read the intellectual commentary in early 60s, it distinguishes between what were called technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals. They're the good guys. And the value-oriented intellectuals, who are what McGeorge Bundy called the wild men in the wings. You know, got to get rid of them. People who are talking about kind of things we've been talking about. Can't have that. We want well-disciplined, technocratic, value-oriented intellectuals who do the hard, serious work. They take control. The Kissingers, for example. In fact, Kissinger put it pretty well himself once. He said, what it takes to be an effective intellectual is to be able to formulate clearly the opinions and needs of the powerful. They're pretty bad at it, but we intellectuals can formulate it for them. So Nixon, in some drunken stupor, said something about bombing Cambodia, and Kissinger was able to translate it to the head of the Air Force. He said, bombing campaign and massive bombing in Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. That puts it clearly. Takes a well-trained Harvard intellectual to make it clear.
This is what I appreciate so much about your writing on these intellectuals during this period, just how fraudulent they are and how easily, how sharply you point that out in terms of their technical systems. But I wanted to go back, I guess, a little bit to the relationship between Marxism and anarchism on this question of intellectualism. And I know there's various strands and there's various schools. And of course, you call yourself an anarchist, not a Marxist. You have nice things to say of Marxists, and you, I think, tend to look at least contemporary capitalism as a class-based society. But I was wondering if you could sort of tease out some of the differences for me, and just, in general, why you call yourself an anarchist and not a Marxist.
Well, I should mention that Bakunin, who we quoted before, is condemning the Marxists for developing a red bureaucracy. He called himself a Marxist. He accepted Marxist economics. So it's not that there's a sharp antagonism. If you look at left Marxism, Rosa Luxemburg, Anton Pannekoek, the people who Lenin condemned as utopian intellectuals, they were very close to the anarchists. In fact, when you look at the Spanish Revolution, which is quite telling because it was a real anarchist revolution, it's pretty strongly supported by many of the leading Marxist figures who were impressed to see the popular revolution developing. In fact, go back to, say, 1905, the first Russian Revolution, there was also already a split between the Leninists and those who Lenin later called ultra-leftists, who were critical of Lenin's approach to revolution as based on a vanguard party that would be run by a central committee with the maximal leader taking over from the central committee. Actually, one of the ultra-leftists at that time was Trotsky, who was quite critical of the Marxist tendencies, of the Leninist tendencies. So this is a struggle that goes way back. Mm-hmm. And it played itself out on the ground in 1917, the revolutionary year. Actually, the histories of this period tend to be a little bit misleading because they concentrate on the articulate sectors, the people who were publishing documents, April theses, and so on. But there was things happening on the ground, a lot. In fact, one of the first books about that just appeared pretty recently. Very good book by Christopher Reed. It's called From Czar to Soviets. It's the first careful study I've seen of what was actually happening on the ground in the revolutionary year, 1917, before it was pretty much tamed by the Bolshevik takeover, and very illuminating. But these things are always happening. Same with the American Revolution and the English Revolution, everyone you look at. Lots of things happening on the ground that are not necessarily the same as what you see floating to the surface among the elite intellectuals who write the history.
Makes a lot of sense. This is a bit of a side note, but I was curious to learn a little bit more about what an anarchist philosophy of science might be. And you've been very critical of certain so-called left schools of sort of relativistic theories of science. And I don't want to kind of re-adjudicate that because I think people know that, but I don't know that people know as much what the kind of anarchist ideal of science might be like, and science and sort of popular intelligence generally. But what is the beginnings of an anarchist theory of science?
Actually, on this matter, I'm pretty conservative. Mm-hmm. I spent most of my life at the premier research institution in the world, MIT. You go to a good research lab, it's run on anarchist principles. People working together, cooperatively, sharing ideas. There's no hierarchy. If a graduate student comes up with a smart idea, you try to pursue it and develop it. I mean, I'm slightly idealizing, but it's not very different from this.
Mm.
That's the way science ought to work. It also ought to involve the general public.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you go back to the 30s, my childhood, the left intellectuals, mostly from the Communist Party in those days, considered it just part of their vocation to be teaching worker education courses. People like Bernal, great scientists, were spending time giving talks and lectures in workers' education groups, actually the kind that members of my own family would attend, people without much education, but the books like Mathematics for the Millions
Mm-hmm.
by a left mathematician were intended to bring mathematics, exactly as it said, to the general public. You're not going to understand the details, but you can grasp what it's about. And so you go from the free interchange of a really effective advanced research group to talking to working people about the basic nature of science and mathematics. It's all a seamless web. I can't see how you can improve on that.
Mm. I want to go forward a little bit in time. We've been talking a lot about Lippmann and the kind of mid-century technocratic liberal milieu, like largely inspired by kind of progressive ideals of an expert-run society, ostensibly. And I'm curious about how this story changes, if it does, in the 70s onwards, as the Democratic Party embraces a more neoliberal turn. Do you think theories in the liberal intelligentsia about expertise and technocracy change at all as the state kind of hollows itself out in many ways?
Well, what happened in the 1970s is critical to the modern period. In the political arena in the United States, there are two political parties, but they've been properly termed a single party, the business party, with two factions, a more extreme pro-business faction, a less extreme pro-business faction, which had interests of working people and the poor. It's the Republicans and the Democrats. In many ways, they were almost indistinguishable in the moderate range. So a moderate, what's called a moderate Republican and a liberal Democrat they weren't all that different. You go back to Eisenhower's talks. It's almost amazing to read them now. Sounds like a raving left-wing maniac. Talks about how anybody who doesn't accept the New Deal doesn't belong in our political system. Anyone who tries to impinge on the right of working people to organize, we don't want them in our political system. That's the last conservative president. After that, you just get reactionaries. Mm-hmm. But that all changed in the 70s. The Republicans moved to a form of savage capitalism. It's called neoliberalism, basically class war, unrestrained class war. The Democrats pretty much abandoned the working classes. The last gasp was the Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill in 1978, which Carter didn't veto, but he watered it down so that it was toothless, just voluntary. By then, the Democrats were becoming a party of affluent professionals, Wall Street, Clintonites, people who show up at Obama's parties on Martha's Vineyard and so on. It's not a working class party. And So they basically handed the working class over to their class enemy, the rabid class enemy, the Republicans. And in fact, Reagan's first act as president was to bitterly attack the labor movement with what were then considered illegal means, like scabs, replacement workers, opened the doors for a major corporate assault on labor, which made sense. When you're going to carry out a major savage class war, you better eliminate the defenses. And the main defenses are the labor unions. Well, they had an ideology at hand that they could pick up to use to justify the class war. It's what's called neoliberalism, goes back to the 1920s. And we might recall that the guru, the leading figure of neoliberalism, Ludwig von Mises, back in the 1920s, was strongly pro-Mussolini. He regarded Mussolini as the savior of Western civilization because he had crushed the working class. He had eliminated unions, which were an impediment to what's called sound economics. You have to, and in fact, the next great move of the neoliberals was into Chile under Pinochet, which was perfect. No dissent, no labor movement. Torture chambers took care of that. You could run the experiment freely. Then on to bigger game, the Reagan administration. So it's all sort of sitting there. Pick it up. Most of it is based on fraud. It's a lot of fancy talk about markets and so on, but they don't believe a word of it. There's massive market interference to the benefit of the rich and powerful. It's you guys, working people and middle class, you're out there in the market trying to survive somehow, not us. We have a powerful state to support us. And that's neoliberalism. And so the ideology was sitting there. The business world was, of course, strongly agitating for it. Political classes had abandoned working people. You get into the period of the last 40 years, there's some pretty good measures of what happened. So Rand Corporation, highly respectable research institution, estimated the transfer of wealth in the past 40 years from working people and the middle class to the top 1%, roughly $50 trillion. It's not small change. And it's representative of what was going on. Privatize things, deregulate, move to monopolies, have crashes, taxpayer steps in and bails out the perpetrators. And it's been called the bailout economy by economists Robert Paul and Jerry Epstein. It's about right. So there's a lot of nice talk about markets, but maybe the people actually believe what they're saying, but it has almost nothing to do with what's happening.
Yeah. Case in point, Silicon Valley, right, which is a creature of public investment. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about Silicon Valley is that there's this strange kind of new intellectual strands of some people call Neoreactionaries. And I'm thinking about a strand of right-wing thought that follows maybe James Burnham, Michael Lind, and now you see kind of populist articulations of this like Tucker Carlson, and then far right figures like Curtis Yarvin, who have a really keen critique of elite bureaucracy. They're fraudulent, I should say, because they're essentially fascists that want monarchy. But it does seem like there's a lot of intellectual energy, at least rhetorically, on the right now about critiquing bureaucratic power, which in some way resonates with anarchism, in other ways not at all. But I'm just curious, from your point of view, what do you make of the kind of right neo-populist critique of expertise and technocracy?
Neo-populist, yeah, there's a little gap in what they're saying.
Yeah.
What they're actually in favor of is the worst kind of autocracy and domination that exists, namely by unconstrained, concentrated private power. That's the bottom line. Let's get rid of anything that gets in the way of the very rich and powerful to maximize their wealth and power.
Mhm.
Absolutely the worst kind of tyranny you can imagine. That's what's the unexpressed part of that critique of bureaucracy. We see it, we've just seen it in the Supreme Court decision, very interesting Supreme Court decision on West Virginia versus EPA.
Yeah.
Just take a look at what's at stake. It's all framed in very democratic, libertarian rhetoric. But if you think about it for a minute, just think what it says. The technical issue was, can the EPA regulate emissions in particular plants? And the decision by the Roberts Court is that this is a major issue, has to be settled by Congress. Congressional legislation has to do it. Well, the fact of the matter is that the way the modern state works, Congress passes, in the days when Congress is functional, not today, Congress passes general legislation and delegates to the administrative agencies the responsibility to work through them, check the scientific information, make specific decisions about what should be regulated, for example. Well, the Roberts Court says, no, you can't do that. Congress has to legislate it specifically, which of course it can't possibly do. I mean, even imagine a Congress that's functional, that works, where people are trying to do something. They don't possibly have the expertise or the time to go through to decide whether you can increase emissions in this coal plant, you know? So the authorities delegated. Well, the line of these anti-bureaucratic people is we have to get rid of the administrative state.
Mhm.
Everything has to go back to popular decision in Congress, which is totally impossible. So the end result, the bottom line is, let the private corporations do anything they feel like. That's what comes out as soon as you think it through for 5 minutes. So yes, there's nice libertarian rhetoric, except what it's asking for is the most extreme form of tyranny that humans have ever devised, and one which incidentally will destroy us very quickly. It's well understood that if you allow the free market actually to function, we're dead. It's a suicide pact. Mm-hmm. That's why business has always intervened to protect itself from the ravages of the market. They're not so stupid as to believe the rhetoric they're producing. It's you guys out there. You're out there in the market trying to survive, not us. Mm-hmm. We have a powerful state to protect us.
I think you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%. But one of the things that I'm curious about is I think that a lot of people get kind of swept up or wrapped up in these kind of anti-bureaucratic politics for justified, maybe not justified, but understandable reasons. Like they're disillusioned with bureaucratic authority, they're disillusioned with government in general, and these people offer a repudiation. And of course, I want to critique them, but I also don't want to just reify the existing liberal technocratic order. So how do you mount a kind of sophisticated critique of unjust hierarchies and bureaucratic authorities that doesn't then serve this kind of right-wing agenda? I mean, what should our approach to some of these politics be as a left in general, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think, as always, it's useful to look at concrete cases. Mm-hmm. And there are some very interesting studies. So there's a great book by sociologist Arlie Hochschild, forgotten what it's called, but Berkeley sociologist, left sociologist, went to live in the Louisiana bayous probably the most reactionary place in the world. And she found some very interesting things quite related to this. So they're living the poor people there are living in what's a kind of cancer alley, huge amounts of cancer. They understand why. It's all pollutants from the chemical plants and so on. But they vote for the right-wing congressmen who support this. And she was really interested in looking into the nuts and bolts of it and found out a lot. So, for example, she's talking to right-wing environmentalists who want to deal with the problem, but are strongly opposed to the government bureaucracy. And their picture, when they describe it, is this. They said, look, some guy comes down from Washington wearing a fancy suit and tells us, you can't fish because the water's polluted. Well, there goes my livelihood. He doesn't do anything about those chemical plants over there. Why should I pay attention to him? He says, the science says you can't fish. Is he dealing with the issues? Of course I hate bureaucracy. That's what it is. It's telling me I can't live. We saw the same thing in the last election. One of the striking things in the last election was the shift in votes in places like South Texas. These are regions which, mostly Mexican-American regions, which hadn't voted for a Republican in 100 years. A lot of them switched to the Republicans. There's a lot of study of it. Take a close look. What was found was you've got communities that survive on oil production. A bureaucrat from Washington comes down and tells them, look, it's environmentally terrible. You got to stop oil production. What happens to my family? What happens to, how am I going to provide for them? They don't come down and say, here's a concrete program which you can carry out that'll help you get to a better life by working for sustainable energy, closing the wells and so on. Actually, there are people who do that, like Bob Pollan, my economist at UMass, is in the lead on these things, colleague of mine and friend. He has worked in West Virginia with miners, in Ohio with miners, working on programs like this, and they're receptive to them. In fact, the United Mine Workers actually formally accepted programs for a transition from coal to renewable energy, which had provisions in it to attend to the needs of the people who were going to have to transition to a new economy. Okay, you do that, you can get people organized, we'll take it over, we'll run it, and we'll move to a better life. But if the bureaucrat just comes down and says, sorry, you can't do this, it's bad for the environment, some scientist told me that, and you and your family can starve if you want, that's not going to work. That's pretty much what happened in the Yellow Vest movement in France a couple of years ago, same thing. The slogan was, you guys are worrying about the end of the earth, I'm worrying about the end of the month, you know? Well, you're not going to work on the end of the month, no reason why people should pay attention to you. So yes, there's understandable reasons, and a serious left movement, serious left party, if one existed, would be working on this.
Noam, it's 1 o'clock. I had one or two more questions. I don't know if I can sneak one more in. Do you have?
That's right.
Okay. I'm curious about, so it strikes me that now in the alternative media, especially in the United States, there is definitely a resurgent interest in socialism, you know, thinking about Jacobin and the kind of post-occupied, post-Bernie milieu. I don't know that there's a resurgent interest in anarchism. And in fact, there have been a few books, for example, I'm thinking of Lee Phillips, his book, The People's Republic of Walmart, that kind of makes the case for a central planning, technologically enabled sort of technocratic socialism, essentially. And it's just one example. There's been other cases where it seems to me that some of the mainstream of the socialist press is kind of going in this technocratic central planning sense. And I'm just wondering, what is the state of the left, do you think, in relation to some of these questions around technocratic control and anarchism that we've been talking about?
Well, there is a fair amount. One of the most developed components of this is what's called participatory economics, Paracon, worked about by Mike Albert, Robin Hannell, Steve Shalom, a couple of other people, which is worked out, has thought through these questions in very significant, extensive detail, has interesting, careful programs to try to overcome these problems. Not a lot in the domain of practice. There's some if you take things like the New Systems Project, Gorel Perovitz and others, they don't talk in these terms, but it's basically the same. Let's go into the Rust Belt, and instead of people just collapsing and taking opioids and committing suicide, which is what's happening, let's develop worker-owned, worker-managed enterprises which fit into the growing post-industrial society. Okay, that's a constructive way to deal with the same thing. There's other things like that, localism in agriculture, for example. So there's lots of scattered developments here and there, which I think are, it doesn't matter whether they call themselves anarchists or whatever they call themselves, but they're the elements of a self-governing, free, just society with no power concentrations. Radically different than what's called libertarianism here, which means tyranny, the worst kind of tyranny. Shouldn't be fooled by the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the actions and specific proposals, there are many authentically libertarian developments.
Mm-hmm. My last question is really about some of these anti-democratic assumptions within academia that we've been talking about. There's certain corners of left academia that have, I would say, a kind of latent hatred or mistrust of the general public, and the rising scepter of fascism sort of, in some ways, intensifies that. There's a deep mistrust of popular intelligence. And you've never been that way, despite rising to the height of intellectual culture. I'm wondering how you maintain that, and if you have just a general message for left intellectuals about this question of the popular intelligence, and not deriding it.
Well, I've never found it very difficult. For one thing, it's just a fact about the general public. They're not stupid and ignorant. And there's, as we were talking about before, a lot of tradition of intellectual interest and creativity in the general public and the working classes, which can either be stimulated or suppressed. You have your choice. If you have educational programs where you beat it out of people, like teaching to test, of course, you're great stupid people. If you encourage it and stimulate it, okay, you get people that can be citizens of an actual democratic society. John Dewey's approach, which I sort of grew up with myself.
Yeah.
But these are choices. If you spend your time in elite circles, as in fact I've done most of my life, you can't be overly impressed, frankly.
That's a beautiful note, I think, to end on. Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight and an honor to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you.
What if we put the smartest people in charge? As long as they had my politics, I'm sure we'd be better off. That's the allure of technocracy. Over the next 3 episodes, we tell stories of technocracy's past, present, and future.
We're so far left that we make communism look bourgeois.
You'd have these sort of free-floating platforms in international waters where you build ideal societies, city-states, governed according to the sort of purely capitalistic, non-democratic model.
What is it that makes a computer system or a telecommunication system socialist?
Our series is called Technocracy Now. Subscribe to Darts and Letters.